Now, we did talk a little bit about cadastral surveying in the second session. So session 3 is about cadastral surveying and GIS, and there's a lot going on. We have a couple of presentations that really hit the mark on how surveying and surveyors benefit from using GIS. The first speaker is Preston Dowell. He started surveying in the private sector in 1998. And doing all things surveyors do: construction surveying, Alta surveys, PLSS corner restoration. But in 2011, he started as the deputy county land surveyor in St. Louis County, focusing on PLSS. He's the chair of the Parcel and Land Records Committee in Minnesota for the Minnesota Geospatial Advisory Council. And I usually don't put these kind of things in there, but it's kind of cool. He was the 2020 NSPS Surveyor of the Year. His talk is going to be on the St. Louis County Survey Explorer. It's a web map that links archived survey records with the county's GIS database. And the second speaker in this session is Louis Beauchamp. He's a land surveyor with BLM in Nevada. Has been working with the Nevada PLSS dataset as a PLSS dataset manager for the last 4 years. He's an OIT grad with a minor in geomatics with a minor in GIS, and teaches GIS for surveyors. So at Great Basin College, I have a great interest in carrying on a conversation with Lucas on that. And as we know, BLM manages about 250 million acres of land, and it's been surveyed in different forms for the past 200 years. And GIS is integral to managing, collecting, and collecting that data and sharing it with the public. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Preston and kick this session off.
All right, thanks, Brent. Does everybody see my screen there? Does that look okay?
Let's see. Yeah, looks great. Yeah, okay. Looks great.
Sounds good. I'll just get started here then. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, my name is Preston Dowell. I am the Deputy County Surveyor up here in St. Louis County. Just to give you a feel for what St. Louis County is we're the largest county east of the Mississippi. We're about 60 miles wide by 130 miles long. We are larger than three states, which basically means we got a lot of information, a lot of work to do. So my presentation here is going to kind of talk about what our office does, how we manage our records, and how we then we take that information, we integrate that into our GIS system so that we can improve all of our data for our constituents and for our residents within the county. All right. So the main goal of the county surveyor's office is to maintain the public land survey system. You heard Jan talk about that a little bit in his presentation, and I'll be talking about that primarily during this presentation. And it really is the backbone of the parcel data system. So I heard in that in the panel discussion earlier that term "get it surveyed." I'm with you. I hate that term. It drives me nuts when people say stuff like that, because it doesn't do us any good. We need to work together to figure out how to improve this system. Part of that is getting the information, getting corners surveyed, getting parcels surveyed, and part of it is taking that data and improving the GIS data sets that are based off of it. So we need to work together, and by saying things like that, I think we divide our profession rather than bring it together. And I think that's great that that's what we're trying to do here, is take these two professions and work together towards common goals rather than trying to divide and separate them. So our office maintains that backbone. This includes the records of our PLSS corners and the surveys that are on file in our office. So our office, and in Minnesota in general, the current standard for when you maintain or restore a PLSS corner is to file a certificate of location to government corner. Most surveyors, I'm sure it's different around different parts of the country, but it's going to give you the same basic framework. You're going to go out there and research the written record, figure out what's out there, where the corner might be. You go out in the field and you search for the evidence of the corner on the ground, then make a decision as far as where that corner position is. You file that corner certificate, and in our case, we file it with our county recorder's office. And then what we do is we add it into an actual database, and it's a database that we started adding it into about 20 years ago. So this was prior to us really even adopting GIS technology, but we had a textual-based database for our PLSS corners. Well, now we take that database and we integrate it into our GIS data for the use of our auditor's office in updating our Parcel Fabric and our parcel data. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So here's just an example of what a corner certificate that we put together looks like. On the left, you're going to see the corner monument itself and the ties that tell a surveyor or a landowner, hey, here's where the corner is. And you can go out there, you can find these ties, and down on the lower right there, you're going to also see a geodetic coordinate associated with it. And we put those on again so that we can put it in our database and we can start updating our cadastral system. On the back of every corner certificate, you're going to see a history, and that's going to tell you the history of the known information associated with that corner and why we came to the decision we came to when we restored that corner to the position we restored it at. So when I talked about that control point database, we've transitioned that control point database into being a geospatially represented database. We still maintain the database in we use Access to maintain it, but on the back end, I believe it's an SQL database now. But we represent it now in our GIS data systems and on web maps. And what happens is you can go into our Survey Explorer. This is what you're seeing here. You get some basic information in the pop-up if you click on one of our corners out there. And then you can click on, if you were to click on this hyperlink here, it would give you a report that would summarize that corner certificate that we just looked at. So it gives you all the information you need to see where that corner is, why it's there, and how good the data is as far as for use for you. And when it comes to corner recordation and PLSS maintenance, the main thing that we need to do is we need to use survey records to get us to the right spot. And I'll talk about this a little later. And it's a misnomer that people don't really understand, is that we don't know where all the corners are. This is not just a problem in St. Louis County. This is a problem across the entire state. And I would argue it's a problem across the entire country. The reality is the PLSS across the United States has fallen into disrepair, and the only way that we're going to figure out how to update our cadastral systems is by going out there and restoring it. And I'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation as well. But here's just an example of all of the survey records that we have. That's not the only survey records we have. We have a pretty vast library. But these are all the different things we need to look at before we can go out and figure out where a corner position is. And I like to highlight this particular section here, because this section here, if you look on the east side of the section, it looks pretty normal, right? That looks like about a normal section is going to be what? 1 square mile by 1 square mile. This one happens to be 1 mile long on the east side, but it's a half a mile short on the west side. That's pretty bad. Right? I mean, how many people are going to see a section that is actually a half a mile short? And I'll tell you, this isn't the worst one that we have in our county. We have theories why things like this happen, but it'll take us too much time to go through that in this presentation. But the reality is, how do we know that that's a half a mile short? How do we know that this corner is in the right spot, or is it just some bad position? Well, again, we go back to our survey records and we find that in 1898, we had some surveyors that tell us from the southwest corner to the northwest corner of section 31, that distance was 2,292 feet. So we've got records going back to 1898 telling us exactly where that corner is. And that's why those survey records are so important. So what are survey records? Well, of course, they're not digital in most cases, right? Because we've been maintaining these records for 100, 150 years, and they didn't have digital stuff, back 100 years ago. It's all paper, and it's all in file cabinets, and it's all in drawers. So what you end up having to do is you have to go through all these different records, and you have to sift through all this information to try and figure out where the information is when you're restoring a corner and maintaining a PLSS corner. So what our office did about 20 years ago, we started doing this as well, as we started taking every record in our office and indexing it and adding it into our county surveyor's master index. And what we would do is we would just index it pretty basically based on township, range, and section here. And then we'd get some basic information about it. What that allowed us to do is to make it easier for us to find the records that we have in our office so that we can continue to do our work. Well, the next iteration of that, of course, is to start digitizing those records, because how hard is it for you to go through and start sifting through survey records? I mean, of course, as a surveyor, I love sifting through records. That's what we do. But it is kind of a pain in the butt, because like I said, St. Louis County is so large that I work up in Virginia. It takes, which is, I don't even know, like 60 miles north of our main office in Duluth. And it takes me an hour to get down there to go look through those records. That takes a lot of time. So the natural progression is for us to start scanning those records, and then we started linking those records in with that master index. So now we had the ability to start looking through our indexes and clicking on a link, pulling it up on a computer screen, making our lives a whole heck of a lot easier. But we didn't stop there. I mean, the next iteration is, okay, we've got all this GIS data and we have all these paper records. What are we going to do with this? How do we link these two things together? Well, it's a pretty straightforward answer if you're a surveyor, right? And if you're a GIS professional, the thing we have in common is section, township, range. And what we did is we were able to link all that information together into a web map based on that section, township, range information. And that web map is our Survey Explorer. Again, and what we call it is our online map optimized for researching our survey records maintained by our county. It's for surveyors by surveyors. And the reason I say that is if you're not a surveyor and you start looking for the information, you might be confused a little bit as far as what some of the indexing guidelines are and conventions are. It might be a little hard for you to find the information. And if you went in there and you didn't know how to read a field book, and you saw, oh, there's something for my particular piece of property, and all of a sudden the field book gets opened up and it's a bunch of angles and distances, you might not understand what you're looking at. So it really is for surveyors by surveyors, but we do make it available to the public. It gives us easy access to our known corner data, our project area, so that people know where we're working, where we have contracts, all that kind of information. And it also gives us scanned copies of the records. So it's going to be easy access to those scanned copies that I talked about. So instead of having to go through a textual PDF, like the PDF of that master index that we had before we had this Survey Explorer was something like 8,000 pages and bookmarked by section, township, range. And it was pretty unwieldy to try and get information out of. Now you can go to the Survey Explorer and you can just go ahead and you can click on some buttons and you can get the information. I encourage all of you, we're not going to go through a demo or anything like that, but the link is right here in the presentation. I encourage you to look up St. Louis County Surveyor's website. The link is right on that page there. You can go ahead and dig around in there and play with it and see what kind of records we have. This is fully open to the public and we encourage everybody to see what we have. We're pretty proud of it. So I'm just going to do a quick screenshot that shows, again, it shows what happens when you click on a survey, or not a survey, of a corner. But it also on the left-hand side over in here, you see these three buttons. Those buttons give you access to our CSMI information. And what you would do is you maybe enter a township range in a section, and what will happen is a little spinning wheel of anticipation will happen here. And once that gets, once it processes it, you can click on a hyperlink and it'll pop you over into our master index report, and you're going to have easy access to our master index report. That's made our lives internally extremely easy. It's accelerated our program as far as corner restoration. So why is that so important? Well, the reality is, as we talked about earlier, is we've got about 25,500 corners in the county. 10,000 of those are in our control point database. So if you go back, if you kind of think back to what Jan was talking about in the GCDB, You know, a lot of that is based on assuming that the PLSS is that generally 1 mile square by 1 mile square system. When you have situations where you're missing a half a mile, or you have situations where corner monuments are 200 to 300 feet away from where you would anticipate, that's not really modelable by that GCDP. The only way you can model that, the only way you can know where these corner positions are and subsequently use that in your GIS data is by locating the PLSS corners that are out there. And again, you can look at just in our county alone, we're missing over half of them. We just don't know where they are at. So the rest of them are just unknown. And we're not even talking 16th corners, you know, 256 corners, plat corners, private parcel corners, you know, any meets and bounds things. We are just talking about the PLSS. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because the auditor's office maintains our parcel fabric. That parcel fabric is what we utilize in order to come up with our parcels. And those parcels are the spatial representation of what the county intends to tax. And guess what we use for our taxable areas? The information that the auditor's office comes up with from the parcel fabric. So if the parcel fabric is incorrect as far as spatially, as far as the area goes, our constituents might be paying something they shouldn't be paying for their taxes. Now, the reality is, I think everybody hopefully in this room knows, and if you don't, I'll just kind of put it out there, that these parcels, these tax parcels can never represent parcel boundaries. You guys were talking about it in that panel discussion. What is, you know, the difference between land surveying and, you know, the GIS and geospatial world? This is one of the things. Parcels can represent taxable area, but they cannot represent parcel or property boundaries. And the reason why is because they're parcel or property boundaries are governed by survey law and monumentation. It's impossible to expect a county, a city, any sort of government authority to go out and actually survey every single property in the world to come up with a geospatially accurate parcel data. It is not realistic. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to make those parcels as accurate as we can. And that's where surveyors and GIS professionals need to work together to fix this problem and not just ignore it. So in our case, and what I will push till, you know, hopefully till the day I die, is that we need to improve the accuracy of tax parcels. We must reestablish the PLSS across the state and across the country. And that's what we do in our county. We then integrate our PLSS data into our parcel fabric so that our auditor's office can go ahead and update the tax parcels. So this next slide, I'm going to kind of give you a, you know, surveyor's take on tax parcels and what happens. So here's the tax parcels. Here's the big boogeyman on the left, right? The scary alien tax parcels that surveyors don't like. And hey, there's a skeleton. That's the backbone of the system. That's an accurate PLSS. If we have that accurate PLSS, what do we get? Oh, well, we get Don Draper over here, right? He's some good looking stuff going on, right? If we have good tax parcels and we have good PLSS, things should probably look good. And here's a good example of that. We've got an area where we've updated our PLSS data, and that tax parcel data has been updated according to that, and all of a sudden everything starts to line up. Things start to make sense. We don't see all kinds of potential problems on our mapping, you know, because kind of like Jan said earlier, what's wrong? Is the map wrong or is the data wrong? Well, if you don't have an accurate PLSS, I'm just going to say most of the time the data is going to be wrong if you do not have that accurate PLSS. And here's an example of that. What happens when you have those big bad tax parcels and you take out that accurate PLSS? Well, you get a hot mess. You don't know what you're going to get. You might get something close, and you might get something like this. Here's an example of an area that we've recently resurveyed in. We've determined where the PLSS lines are. And here's where the parcel line is shown today, this blue line over here. But this parcel, this tax parcel over here, this happens to be tax forfeited land. This is public land. Any landowner, any decision maker might look at this and go, oh my goodness gracious, we got a big problem. What in the heck are we going to do about it? Well, if we actually go out and survey it, we actually find this line to be over in here. This is about 300 feet off. This is not uncommon in my area, and I would say that it's not uncommon across our state, and it's probably not uncommon across the country, because as Jan was talking about, how did they build the PLSS data sets in the first place for the GCDB? A lot of it was digitized off the COD maps, and that was the best information that they had. It's not necessarily the most accurate, but it was good enough for what they were trying to do at the time. So this is what happens when you have bad parcel data or bad PLSS data. You're going to probably have bad parcel data that goes along with it. So most of the positions that were utilized in our initial parcel mapping, they were calculated from different things, you know. And the reality is today, this parcel mapping was done 10, 15 years ago. We still only know where less than half of our corners are. If we don't know where those corners are, how can we know where the corners that are based off of them are? We've got a problem here, you know. So we got to ask ourselves, how is that parcel data developed? Well, they'll tell you, the people that develop it will say, well, it was the best information available. And I'll argue, no, most of the time, it's not the best information available. It was the easiest information available. And that's okay. It's just, that's just the reality. I mean, to wait to complete a survey of the entire county before you build a parcel data set is just not realistic. So they needed to use the information they have and move forward. But now the question is what do we do going forward? So again, just to kind of reiterate, our parcel data was based on tax legals with mostly unknown section corner locations. I'd argue that's pretty common across the country. And if you take those approximations and you add more approximations, you're going to get that hot mess I'm telling you about. The parcel data is a spatial representation of what we intend to be taxing. And ultimately, if you're, you know, and if you're in the land records office, and something like this comes up, please, 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 if a landowner wants to know their boundaries, don't tell them that, oh, the GIS data is pretty close. Have them contact a surveyor. It'll make everybody's life a lot easier. So we have we have a lot of this, and we have a lot of this. We have some good stuff, and we got some bad stuff. What does that mean? So what do we have to do? Well, we have to realize that the PLSS data should be the framework upon which parcel data is developed and maintained, at least in the PLSS states. I realized out east in the colonial states and different areas, maybe you don't have to rely on the PLSS as much. But in Minnesota, we sure do, and most of the United States, we sure do. But that doesn't mean that we should bury our heads in the sand. We need to utilize all available tools to accurately remindment the PLSS and work with our GIS professional and counterparts in order to create more accurate representation of tax parcels. And I think that's the key. And I think that's what we've been talking about this whole time, is that survey world and the GIS world, we're not that far apart. We just have to decide, we have to figure out how to work together on things like this, rather than, you know, try and separate ourselves. And that's why I'm so glad that you guys asked me to come here and talk to you today. The final thing I want to talk about is that, you know, we feel so strongly about this. We've been working on this in Minnesota for, you know, a long time, and we're trying to figure out a way to actually remonument the entire PLSS across the state. So as Brent said, I work with our Geospatial Advisory Council. We're actually moving forward on a PLSS remonumentation program for Minnesota. We're gonna try and introduce some legislation that creates a program to accelerate remonumentation in Minnesota, because we've collected the data across the state, and St. Louis County is representative of the entire state. We have about, you know, half of our corners in our state are unknown. We don't know where those locations are. I would venture to guess for most of you, if you're in a PLSS state, you're seeing the same thing in your area. So I would encourage you to start looking at trying to figure out ways to increase PLSS remonumentation. There's a hyperlink here that takes you to our hub site. which will give you more information. You can take a look at that legislation. If you think it's a good idea, no matter if you're from another state or another organization, we'd love to get your support, because it's going to take a lot of work and for us to get this thing going through Minnesota. So with that, my presentation is complete. I don't know if we have time for question and answers, or if we should just move on. Let Brent and Wendy, you guys decide.
Well, I think there's one good question, Preston. And by the way, nice presentation. I think what you're doing is there's a couple comments regarding the accuracy of tax parcels, but that's the opportunity for surveyors. The opportunity for surveyors is to say, okay, we can make this data better. It's not legal for conveyance. All maps are representations. Except surveys, which are licensed opinions. So, but I think that was a great presentation, and we'll see if we have time to, after Lucas's presentation, if we have time for a couple of the questions. But check the chat, Preston, and maybe you can reply to.
Okay, yeah, I can answer some questions while Lucas is going.
Perfect. All right, Lucas, you ready?
Thanks, everybody.
Hello, Lucas. Are you there?
Apologies, I was on mute there.
And so we've only been doing this 18 months, 20 months. You'd think we'd know where the hell the mute button was, huh?
Absolutely.
I know, it's okay. Go ahead and share your screen if you can. Perfect.
All right, thanks everyone. First thing I want to do is, I didn't notice this before, but in the agenda, I did want to correct one small thing, and that's it listed me as a professional land surveyor. I'm currently not, however, I'm on my road to getting there, and I hopefully will be a professional surveyor soon. But I don't want to misrepresent myself as currently licensed. And I do want to add a couple of points to what Preston said, and as someone who works so closely with the PLSS, I highly support the effort they're going through to maintain the PLSS, and it's such a fundamental and important part of having a framework of knowing where things are at. In a similar way, we, at BLM, we're very tied to the PLSS, and it's such a fundamental way to the way we make decisions and the way we handle things for federal purposes. But it's also important for all the other agencies and all the private individuals throughout the states. And so I kind of want to talk a little bit about digital cadastral data, and I'm going to start with like a little bit of history of the way BLM has managed that in the past and sort of how we've modernized where we are now, and a little bit of where we're going in the future. I will say that obviously our data set will overlap, in areas like where Preston's at, and it may be better and it may be worse in our data set or their data set. And I will say that sometimes the local knowledge can have a huge impact. So, the BLM covers large quantities of area. And so sometimes we're trying to cover more ground than we have the people, the manpower, the budget to do so. So in a particular county where they're doing such great work like Preston is, their data set very well might be better than ours. But I do want to talk about our data set. So a little bit of history on digital cadastral data. We started out in the 80s with a thing that Dr. Van Sickle talked about with the geographic coordinate database. And it was understood that we needed a common frame of reference for making decisions about where things are at. And so they started collecting data manually from cadastral survey records. And we entered it into a DOS-based software called GMM, or later WinGMM. And we adjusted that data with least squares to fit together. And in the end, the final product was a series of text files with coordinates and other information about the sort of the metadata of the surveys themselves as well. Later on, it was realized that GIS is becoming a more important part in the world, and we needed GCDB data to be more effective in a GIS environment. Those text files did not did not work so super well in a GIS environment. And so the FGDC, the Federal Geographic Data Committee, created a standard. We're currently on version 2 of the CAD-NSDI, or the Cadastral National Spatial Data Infrastructure. And this was essentially taking our GCDB work and converting it to a GIS-friendly data set. And so we still used that data entered and maintained in GMM, and we then used a conversion software to produce a CAD-NSDI at particular intervals. However, it was a very time-intensive process, and so the times between those CAD-NSDI updates were often, could be up to several years at a time. However, recently, computers have changed, and one of those changes has been, the fact that DOS is no longer an effective software and even included in Windows. And so WinGMM was, kind of aging and was no longer going to be supported by its creators or even able to run in Windows anymore. And so we realized we had to find a replacement software. And so we did some investigation. We started looking into the ArcGIS Parcel Fabric, and that was what was chosen about 2013 to start using as our computational software to update our data that we could then take and turn into a CAD-NSDI publication. And Nevada, the state that I work in, was chosen as the pilot state for that conversion. And it was a major transition with many difficulties. There was, we were converting the entire way we've been doing things for 30 years to an entirely new system and a new data state. And so there were a lot of decisions that had to be made, and there was also an education boundary, because a lot of the people who were involved in this project had been surveyors for a very, very long time and were not super familiar with the GIS environment. And so we made mistakes along the way, and we learned our lessons along the way. And some of the states that came along later, ended up being in a much, much better state than Nevada originally. But we're now in a reasonably stable maintenance environment in the Parcel Fabric, and we're in a situation where it's now easier for us to publish CAD-NSDI now than when we were using GMM. And so we're able to pretty effectively do regular quarterly publications. And I know in my state, Nevada, we try to hit that target every year, and I think we usually do. Some of the other states update on a slightly less frequent basis, and it is one of those things where we covered the entire nation, right? And so there is some variance between state office to state office and one geographic area to another geographic area. And I want to talk a little bit about the update process that we use. And like I mentioned, this is in the Parcel Fabric, and the updates are a very manual process. We take our survey plats that we produce at BLM, and each and every line is individually entered by COGO, entering our bearings and distances, and the control data from the plats are entered as control, and then we do a least squares adjustments of that data and the neighboring data to effectively sort of edge match them together and improve the geospatial accuracy of that area around the new survey, because that new survey is going to be a effective and highly accurate data compared to maybe some of the old, maybe even 1800s era data around it. So we use those new surveys to improve the spatial accuracy. And a little bit about, if you're interested in using the CAD-NSDI, it's a data set that we make available to the public. One thing to know is there are 2 versions. There's a state-specific version, which is updated by the individual in the state who maintains this data, and it may or may not be available in your area. The best way to get it is from Navigator, which is navigator.blm.gov. That's the BLM's geospatial data portal. And if you're in Nevada and want to access our data, we also have a more user-friendly place to download the data from, and that's from this link here, which you can see sort of on the right, which gives you a little easier download place. The other thing is we have a national compiled NSPS. So you have all of the state's data in one data set. It's a little slower to incorporate because you're having to take, you know, individual data sets of millions of parcels and combine them together into one extremely large data set. And so that can run about 3 to 6 months behind in updates. But you can see I also have included a link here to that data set. It's a web feature class that you can access. And you can access that national compilation data set in things like Google Earth by visiting that REST endpoint and downloading it as like a KML, KMZ, and bringing it into things like this, and also using products like ArcGIS Earth to get straight to the data itself. And obviously, the best way to access this data, in my opinion, is to bring it into ArcGIS itself, and you have a lot more control, and it's fully customizable. And in order to do that, obviously, you have to download the data. Now, in terms of using the data, and this is something that I was amazed to see when Dr. Van Sickle was talking, a lot of those warnings and things that he pulled up from the GCDB era, we're using a lot of the same metadata statements and such, you know, and we talk about the fact that, you know, the CAD-NSPS is not an official record, it's not a survey, but it's a great data set for making decisions and for doing project planning and such. And there are known issues, and we're always looking to improve our data and to make it as good as we possibly can. But we are suffering the same hindrances that kind of Preston talked about, where there's a lot of data out there that we just don't have yet. And without going and visiting every corner of the field, we can't have a perfect data set. One thing to kind of talk about is within the CAD-NSPS, there's a series of feature classes, and I'm not going to go through every single one of them here, but we produce a lot of data, including we talk about some like our conflicted areas where we have known survey issues. Maybe we have gaps and overlaps of the PLSS. We also produce meandered water to show the area on survey plats that are water. We have our PLSS points that contain all of our surveyed points, but also contain some of our protracted by survey points like the center quarter and our 16ths. We have our township data, and then our first division data contains your section level data. Second division contains your quarters, your government lots, your aliquot parts. We have our special survey data, which is our non-PLSS surveyed area, like mineral surveys and tracts and BLM parcels, homestead entries, and many, many more. And then there's a very interesting feature class called the intersected, which contains all of these layers in one data set that has been intersected with each other to show the smallest atomic level of the PLSS. And it's a great feature class for use with like automated tools and stuff, but it's a little more difficult to visualize with human eyes. Previously, similar to GCDB, we still use our old GCDB point identifier for all of our points. And if you want more information on that system, you can see this link. But we have basically a way to have a unique point identifier on every single point in the PLSS within the entire United States. And it's a very, very rigorous and very interesting naming scheme. A little bit about points. There was, as Dr. Van Sickle talked about, point reliabilities maintained in GCDB. So every point had sort of an X and Y reliability value attached to them. That would give you sort of a feel for the accuracy of the area that you're particularly looking at. And this was part of the least squares adjustment computation. However, something to be aware of if you are actively using this data is that it may not have been updated since leaving GMM in around 2013. as our current computational software cannot update these values. And so many states, these haven't been updated, or in those states that are updating this data, they may just be taking modern points that have been updated and giving them zeros to show that they're modern values. Something else to be aware of is these are just mathematically computed values. Just because it says 133 feet radius doesn't mean the point will necessarily be there. And so if you are using this as something to go help you find corners, I would obviously encourage you to look even outside this radius value. We also have, similar to our points, our parcels within our data have unique parcel identifiers. So every parcel within our data has a unique identifier within the nation. And you can see sort of based on this diagram below, it's a combination of, your state, your prime meridian, township, range, and then you also go down to like your section and stuff. And it can go all the way down to like the smallest aliquot part as well. And a question I get a lot when I give these kind of presentations, and based on the previous presentations I've seen today, this seems like an audience where this may be less necessary, is I also often get asked, why does the PLSS keep moving on me? And the CAD-NSTI is based on our record cadastral survey data where the PLS is located. And obviously, in the world of surveying, the monuments on the ground is what controls a survey, not the record bearings or distances that are on the plats. And so, when you see, when we update the PLSS, we're not actually moving the PLSS, we're improving our knowledge of where the PLSS actually is on the ground. We're moving our data set to better match the conditions on the ground. And this is particularly the case in Nevada and a lot of the rest of the United States. We have a lot of areas that were last surveyed in the 1800s. And in the CAD-NSTI, we represent these areas with the records we have and with the best knowledge that we have in that area. But the actual locations of the monuments on the ground can vary by a wide margin. And so if you are ever working in an area with old data, or particularly anytime you're working with boundary data in any kind, you always want to talk to a surveyor, whether that's coming and talking with a cadastral surveyor with BLM or talking with a private surveyor in the area you're in. Anytime you're working with close data or boundary data, absolutely always I can always recommend talking with a surveyor. Somewhere we're going in the future, we've recently made the decision to move to the ArcGIS Pro Parcel Fabric. And so we are going to be going through another phase of transition as we move to a new software. And that transition is going to take time, but there's going to be some huge benefits that come out of that, including a much improved least squares engine, the ability to update our reliability values on points, better containing our record data, and things like that. And if you're interested in more about the ArcGIS Pro Parcel Fabric, I believe there's a session on that in this conference, I believe coming up on like Friday or something. But that's a very quick and brief rundown of digital cadastral data from the BLM side. And I can only stress that we're constantly working to improve this data and make it better and make it more usable for the public and for ourselves. It's a great data set for like I talked about, project planning and decision making, but it's not a survey, and it's similar to previous conversations we've had at this conference. It's the best knowledge we have of the location, but it certainly isn't an opinion on a boundary or anything like that. And I'm not sure if we have any questions or anything, or if we have time.
We do have time for a couple questions. And by the way, thanks. That was a great presentation. I do love getting into the history of why things were the way they were and speculating whether it's the whiskey surveys or you're measuring by smokes or whatever those guys did just to make it work back in the day. And there is a Parcel Fabric workshop on Friday. Wendy posted the link into the chat window, so thanks for that. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of comments. You can't. They're essentially you can't fix stupid. And and in one of the early survey summits, I had a solution engineer do a demo, and one of the questions was asked, and this is maybe 15 years ago, about how do you handle people misusing data? And the engineer said, well, you can't prevent people from driving drunk, and it really is kind of true. So there is a challenge that data is going to get misused. A question just popped up from Galen. Would BLM be interested in working with NGS on a GNS PLSS campaign? Now, there was an earlier comment on NOAA being the National Association of All Acronyms or something like that. So I think this is, there's four acronyms in a sense, that's pretty good. Would BLM be interested in working with NGS on a GNSS PLS campaign? I think that's a great idea.
I think that's a great idea, and I can't speak for the agency as a whole, but as someone who works with the PLSS and as an agency like NGS, they've got that fantastic benchmarks campaign going on. Getting that control data that's being submitted to NGS, perhaps sent over to BLM or working collaboration together on that. I think that would benefit both of our products, and it might be something to look into.
Yeah,
I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I think for the people, the GIS folks on the line that are doing parcel mapping or doing work related to county and city parcel mapping, one advantage of the Parcel Fabric is that now that the public land survey is in the Parcel Fabric, if you essentially attach your Parcel Fabric to the BLM Parcel Fabric, assuming the BLM's is more accurate, and when BLM adjusts, then you can adjust your Parcel Fabric as well. So it's pretty, it keeps all these things, I guess it's more like a quilt when that happens than just a fabric, but it keeps these things all connected. So with that, sorry, go ahead.
This is President. I was just going to say, I love what Lucas said about the PLSS is not changing. PLSS is not changing. Our understanding of it is, and what we do with it is changing. And I think that's important. And if anybody takes anything away from these presentations, I think that's a great one to take away.
You're right about that, Preston, because it can be stated even more general that what's on the ground is on the ground. We represent it on maps different ways. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't get it wrong, but what's on the ground is there. And one expertise of surveyors that I think GIS practitioners don't necessarily put these elements together is to take a whole bunch of different documents and data sets and all kinds of stuff, and then go out and actually put a point on the ground. So not only is it about locating and bringing things from the ground into the office and making maps and opinions and analysis and representations, but it's taking information that you gather and finding the most likely spot on the face of the earth where that would be. So I think that's it's another kind of area that we could explore in future survey summits. But thanks, Preston, and thanks, Lucas.